Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my top 10 books for the second quarter of 2022. So, I stole this idea from Dane over at Dane Cobain or Dane Reads. I can never remember nowadays. Dane always puts out these videos where he discusses the top books of a certain quarter each year, and I did that a few weeks ago. Late, but this time we're getting in on time. And I made the decision then that I'm going to hopefully record a top 10 of each quarter of the year. And that will give us a top 40. And then from that top 40, we're going to do something we did years ago. We are going to pick names out of a hat and decide what we'll make our top 10. Something we've decided to do. Because I did record a top 10 video last year where I pulled the name of every single book I read that year out of a hat to get to a top 10, and it was disastrous. Worst video ever. 2 hours of my life. These books are all taken from the books that I read from April until June, and although I read some of this book in March, I didn't finish it until April, and that is The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, translated by Jennifer Croft. This beast of a book cost me £20. As discovered last week, whilst chatting to Charlie Brooke over on her channel, I could have used a bit of a discount on this. It's 900 pages of complete and utter weirdness. So firstly, we've got the titular character of Jacob, who doesn't arrive for a while. This book actually starts with a woman swallowing some sort of talisman that over the course of the book is going to have some sort of metaphysical reaction within her body. I was here for that. I could have just done with a book about that. Just saying. Could have done with a book about this woman navigating the entire universe on her own as she slowly transformed into some sort of TARDIS, into some sort of chrysalis type thing. Well, I was here for that. Jacob arrives, there's some sort of wedding going on, and basically is going to develop some followers. What we're getting here is seeing this man's almost rise to power, this fall. It really follows some sort of classical narrative structure. If we look at... I'm going to reference Cassandra Clare here, who I remember releasing a video back when she only had the City of Bones trilogy out, and Mortal Instruments trilogy of City of Bones, City of Ashes, City of Glass, in which she discussed Dante's Inferno and talked about the descent into hell and then the rise from it. And I think that that is definitely something that you can see within this novel. What I liked was the way that Tokarczuk has crafted this history of a place, and it's not necessarily about the characters that you see within this novel. It's more about the ways in which the world operated at the time, and the way in which, as I kept mentioning when I was reading this novel, religion became a form of survival, and people needed a religion and needed to belong to a people in order to actually live, to be able to get jobs and to get food and to fend for themselves. And it made it very difficult if they were cast out, which is what happens regularly within this novel, because Jacob keeps talking about religion and getting his followers to follow him through every single religion in the world until they reach some sort of nirvana that he's promising, but they don't know whether it's ever coming. There's a lot of mistrust within this novel. I was reminded of the Karamazov brothers when I read this, due to the scope and the way that it left me feeling. I will admit that sometimes I was bored by this book. Sometimes I was finding the reading experience really fast, and sometimes I was finding the reading experience flowing and going extremely fast. And I think that Jennifer Croft has done a fantastic job at translating this, because ended up somewhat stunned. That's all I can say. It was like all of the big books that I've read over the last 10 years compiled into one volume. I was reminded of Hilary Mantel with the Wolf Hall trilogy. I was reminded of the Karamazov brothers. I was reminded of the Luminaries. It was mystical, it was metaphysical, but it was also very human at its core, because you get this sense that this is what the people had to do to survive, and you also learn more. Well, I learned more about a period of history in a place that I did not know about. And I did end up also thinking back to Greek classics and the way that and the relationship between Aeolus and Heracles, or Hercules, I can't remember which one, in the beginning of this novel. And I think that Tokarczuk has done tons in terms of references and So it transpires that after recording, my video cut out whilst I was talking about the books of Jacob. So, whilst I can't remember everything I said in the 4 minutes after I spoke to you, the books of Jacob is one that sticks with me because it's helped me to learn about a place, a time period, and a population that I did not know about. Tokarczuk had definitely done their research when it comes to crafting this narrative, and it was a novel that wasn't necessarily about the characters within the book, but more about emphasising what the lives were like at the time. I'd say there was something in here that was also about the cancel culture of today, and there was an allegory for this in the way that certain bishops could say stuff about Jacob that would be taken as gospel because they were in positions of power. And it gave this idea that what is said about a person is more important than the person's actions themselves. It was the way in which people would follow a person blindly in the hopes of reaching some sort of nirvana, but also finding a space to live. And as I say, religion as a form of survival was a big theme for me in reading this book, but I'm certain that I would get more out of it upon further reading of it. This is a book that you could go back to and constantly find more from, as I also said about the next book that I put on this list. The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki. Now, I empathised with the character of Benny in this novel immensely. When I was 10 years old, my grandfather died, and this was the male figure within my life who I perhaps associated the most with. We read similar books. He introduced me to Star Trek. We liked science fiction, and we would constantly have chats about things, and we just seemed to get each other. And when he died when I was 10, I experienced a ton of grief. And what I liked about this book is that it explored the way that childhood grief isn't necessarily seen as the same as adult grief, or the depression that a child can fall into isn't seen as depression because there's this belief that children can't feel such grand emotions. And I can remember that, and I can remember feeling misunderstood through many years of my life, and holding on to grief and being unable to get over it because it constantly felt like the world was wanting me to move on when I wasn't ready, and you feel like you're trapped in this quagmire. And I think that Ozeki captured that incredibly well when it came to the character of Benny. And I did wonder when I was reading this whether I was bringing too much of my experience into this book. But then I also think that it's the power of a narrative makes you remember things, and your associations can bring so much more strength to what the author is writing about. What I particularly enjoyed about this book was the fact that Ozeki did not shy away from the weird. She did not include these topics where Benny believes that he's hearing objects talk, or the very omniscient book that is within this novel. Ozeki doesn't shy away from that. She leans into it, and with the courage of her convictions as a reader, I felt incredibly confident to follow Ozeki wherever she took this narrative. I think that other writers have been known to shy away from these things in the past because they've worried that they might seem too out there, and readers of general fiction or general readers might not care for these weird, surreal aspects of a narrative, and thus they've tiptoed along the edge of that line. Ozeki falls into that wholeheartedly, and she uses it to craft a narrative that is full of heart, is full of heartbreak, and examines not just the grief of a child, but examines the grief of his mother and the way that grief can affect people differently. Benny's mother begins hoarding, and it creates this war between Benny and his mother because Benny needs order whilst his mother craves chaos. And the Book of Form and Emptiness makes perfect sense when you consider that, because the world is able to recognise that these two people need to be separated from one another, but the world is also able to recognise that actually these are the only two people who are grieving over this one man at the moment, and we have left them by the wayside. And also it examines this way that when people are grieving, we don't necessarily associate with them because we don't want to bring sadness into our lives. We don't want to think about mortality or morbidity because it is seen as morbid and it is seen as dark to want to talk about death. And as myself, like, I talk about death a lot, and when you get to the final Doris book, you're going to find some of my opinions about death within that novel. And that is because it is something that I have come to know much and more over my near 30 years on this planet. Is I have seen a lot of death, a lot of grief, a lot of heartbreak. I've seen how it affects people in many different ways. I've had people die in my life where I've thought, well, that is a relief for them because they were going through so much pain, and I have felt happy for them whilst also feeling sad of their absence. And I feel like this book just does so much at capturing the lives after death and the explosions, the repercussions of such a thing, and manages to capture characters incredibly well. I was thrilled that this book won the Women's Prize for Fiction because it was so deserving. This is a book that upon rereading you will get much more out of. Just as I said for the books of Jacob by Tokarczuk, this is one that I wholeheartedly recommend, but I also recommend that when you read this book that Karen Joy Fowler has said is a masterpiece, which I agree with, when you read this book, don't be put off by the weird and wonderful things. Just accept them and don't question so much in the reading experience. If you just go along for the journey and go along for the ride, you are going to get so much more out of your reading experiences. Next, we have The Paper Palace by Miranda Cowley-Heller, and I read this with my friend Charlie over at Charlie Brook when we were reading the Women's Prize for Fiction and the long list. And I particularly enjoyed this book because it was just a straightforward narrative. Sometimes books are going to come at you and they're going to have all these twists and turns, bells and whistles, all that. This wasn't that. Miranda Cowley-Heller knew what she wanted to do. She set out to do that with this book and just presented us with a straightforward narrative that I particularly enjoyed. So you have the protagonist, whose name I can't remember at this moment in time, but although that is the way for most of the books that I read. But within this novel, she is married and she has just slept with her childhood friend Jonas, and you go back in time and you explore the relationship that they previously had and how they came to be the adults they are. There is a talk of sexual assault and murder within this novel, and there is this almost mysterious aspect to it. However, as the reader, I think that you can understand certain characters' actions within this novel, and I was glad of the way that certain things took place, because due to ways certain characters had been treated, the author fulfilled an obligation here. So again, I'm talking about the reader-writer contract here, and I'm talking about the fact that things didn't come out of the blue. If a twist was going to happen, the author had already set this up beforehand. And so as a writer, might have been able to see stuff coming. I didn't mind that because the author had already said that this might be, she'd hinted that this might be the direction that she was going to take the story. And I was okay with that. I was okay with a straightforward narrative for once. This is a book that, it could be a one and done type book. It could be a book that I go back to and reread just because I know that I don't have anything to worry about here. It was well written, good characterization, just exactly what you want from a novel, really. As I say, sometimes you don't want books that are going to try too hard. This wasn't try hard. This was just perfectly splendid for what it set out to do, and I was here for it. Next, we have a book that I have said that I'm going to do a separate review video for, and I still haven't done that. And that is The Love Songs of W.E.B. Dubois by Honoree Fannone Jeffers. Had I chosen to read this book outside of the Booktube Prize, just as somebody who'd seen people being fans of it, I probably would have DNF'd this book, because I do still have this opinion that the book could have told all of the different stories in different novels and explored certain themes particularly well. I think that this book has many different tales within it, But when we consider the love songs of W.E.B. Dubois, when I went and considered the context in which Fannone Jeffers was writing, which was this idea that there have been so many huge tomes by old white men, and so she was going to write this novel, then I can get on side. Then I can begin to recognise what the writer is setting out to do here. And I can recognise that those huge Victorian tomes also told many different stories that could have perhaps been told in separate volumes. I think that my issues here were that around the 300 page to 400 page point, this story still didn't feel like it was going anywhere. For a lot of time, this book felt incredibly directionless. It is 790 pages, and I'd say until about page 550, it doesn't really find its direction. But it's after you get to this point that all of the pieces of the jigsaw begin to come together, to coalesce, and you have to go into this book with open-mindedness as a reader and with some faith that the writer is getting at something here. Suddenly, all the stories in the past become important, because at one point I was frustrated because you were seeing the same stories told about a mother and then told about a daughter. And it was going back in time. I was like, how are these stories going to link up? And you recognise something. And through examining the way that my family tells stories and certain aspects of this novel, I connected with this book more then than I had done previously. I think that what the author is saying here, when she talks about the ways in which we carry the tragedies of our history, resonated with me, because oftentimes, ever since I was a child, I have been told stories of my family by my grandmother and by older relatives that were around when I was younger. And as I've got older and I've recognised that other relatives the same age as me or younger or older don't know these stories, it feels almost like, well, what am I going to do with them? Because you feel like a lot of weight has been left with you to remember all of these family stories, because you don't want to forget them, because it almost feels like to forget them would be to do history a disservice. The family that is being talked about within this novel has gone through much more tragedy than I could ever imagine, in terms of the way that black lives and black bodies were subjugated in the past and within recent history, really. And the author doesn't do what a certain writer did last year and discuss these people as though they were villains. She presents their actions, and we have to recognise that we recognise through our modern sensibilities that it is a huge tragedy. And from that, I recognise that the weight that this character is experiencing within the novel of holding all of these families' tragedies within her is a huge enormity. And it makes the entirety of the novel make sense. Now, when I say this, I don't say that this book is bogged down by tragedy, because this book is also the tale of a family, and that history is all pulled together here, and it gives it this sense of heart and this sense of characters belonging. And I think that having read this book now, the person who was reading this book 400 pages and thinking it was directionless and that it was rudderless, at page 790 is different, because has come to recognise that there are many different ways of storytelling, and sometimes it takes many different stories to craft one person. And every single one of these tragedies, every single one of these stories is what has led our protagonist to be the woman that she is at the end of this book. And this is, I said to people that this book reminded me of David Copperfield. And the reason I say that is not because it is exploring anything that is explored within Copperfield. It is because of the breadth of storytelling and the way that we are examining an entire person's history. Next, we have The Magician by Colm Toibin, and this tells the biography of Thomas Mann, a fictionalised biography, although the author has definitely done his research when it comes to this one. I put this at the top of my round of judging of the BookTube Prize because of the steady state pace that this novel is told in, and that felt relatively calming to me. I was similar to the Fannone Jeffers, but also completely opposing that. The pace of this is written in such a way as the author is taking their time to tell the story that they wish to tell. He doesn't sensationalize anything. He writes in this pace, and in doing that, it can almost feel cold sometimes. And I think that works in also exploring the character of Thomas Mann, who we're seeing as, unless it was to do with his fiction, he didn't perhaps know how to properly navigate the world in which he lived, and almost had this cold, standoffish quality about him that didn't mean that he didn't love. It just meant that he had a different way of looking at the world. And I think that the author did a good job in exploring that through the prose with this very steady pace. And I thought that was another way of knowing that I was looking at an accomplished writer who recognises that the prose that is being presented on the page also has to be matched with the character that we are exploring. And to have written this very sensationalized novel where everything was huge tragedies and explosive would not have suited the character that he was writing about. Also, I think that the author was trying to emulate Mann's own style of writing, which is more thoughtful and meditative, and I gelled with that quite well. Next, we have The Appeal by Janice Hallett that has a bookmark in it because once I read this book, I lent it to my mother. She didn't care for it as much as me. This is a one and done type book, and I did question putting it on this list, but this was a favourite of the 3 months. I read it over 2 sittings because I was at work the next day, so couldn't have just finished it in one. And you as the reader are being seen as like one of the law students within the book and presented with all this evidence because somebody's been murdered. You need to figure out who the murderer is, who the victim is, and who has been framed. Yes, I'd figured all this out by page 300, but the epistolary fashion of this novel is what spurred me on to continue reading because it does feed into that part of all humanity who rather likes gossip and who will read an entire Facebook thread of insults between people without even knowing them just because it's providing us with some sort of entertainment for the evening. And I think that Hallett did a good job in using that to craft this crime novel. And once again, we have a novel where it's all about what's not said, but what we can suppose from what is from reading between the lines. Not the greatest thing in the world, but also I enjoyed the way that Hallett crafted characters because obviously we're not getting any physical descriptions here. So all of the characters that are being built around what other characters are saying about them. And I think that was an intriguing way to go about crafting characters for a crime novel that reminded me of Agatha Christie's Five Little Pigs or The Woman in White, novels in which you are having the crime and the things that led up to the crime presented by the victims and the suspects as opposed to the detective or the writer. Next we have Wynd, Volume 1, The Flight of the Prince by James Tynion IV and Michael Dialynas. And so this is a world in which magic is outlawed, and Wynd has to hide his pointed ears because he is living in this society where they will kill people who show any form of bodily difference because they could be seen as being magical. In this graphic novel, the Dying King has hired a hunter to come and hunt out any possible magical beings in the town, and Wynd ends up having to go on the run. This book is not just a great piece of storytelling, but has some fantastic queer allegory within its pages. It has a lot within it about found family, and also doesn't shy away from being somewhat dark, and shows the cruelties of the world that seeks to stamp out people who show any form of difference. I think that the art palette is particularly fantastic, and it very much appealed to me. It appealed to me so much that I went ahead and purchased the second volume. Then we have Elena Knows by Claudia Pineiro, translated by Francis Riddle, and I've already talked about that today in my June wrap-up. But here we have a book in which a woman with Parkinson's is exploring the mystery that she has crafted surrounding the death of her daughter. And throughout this narrative, we get to see her come to terms with her daughter's death, but also come to terms with the fact that she might not have been the best mother in the world, but that is something that she's going to have to live with just as much as she has to live with the Parkinson's that is crippling her. What I liked about this book is the way in which there's a narrative tension in the fact that Elena's day is ruled by the pills that she has to take. Because of this, you know that she has to get to a place by a certain point, because otherwise her body will seize up and she won't be able to fulfill what she needs to fulfill. I particularly empathised with the way that Pineiro wrote about Elena's chronic illness. As somebody who has had issues my entire life, specifically at the moment it's to do with arthritis, to see them discussed in this manner just spoke to me. And also having this novel that's not necessarily a crime novel, it's not necessarily a murder mystery. Indeed, I believe it might have been mispackaged, and that is something that is talked about in the afterword of what Pineiro's doing here is telling a very human story, because we all have questions after the death of a loved one, regardless as to whether it is documented as suicide in this novel or death by natural causes. We are all going to have questions following the death of a loved one. And I think that not just giving the character a physical journey, but giving them this very difficult, torturous physical journey leads to this almost sense of transformation as Elena comes to learn the truth and accept what really did happen to her daughter. And this is a tale in which grief is presented exceptionally well as being written in this almost cynical fashion, as Elena recognises the faults of the world in which she inhabits. Then we have Fabulosa, the story of Polari, Britain's secret gay language, by Paul Baker. This is a piece of non-fiction that read to me like a thriller. As I mentioned in my recent wrap-up, Paul Baker writes with such verve that you can't help but read this book as though it is a thriller. It is both heartwarming and heartbreaking to look at a world where gay men started using Polari to protect themselves, only to be maligned in later years by more modern gay men who saw Polari as holding them back, who saw these men who had behaved in a feminine fashion as being woefully out of date. And I think that when we explore gay lives and we talk about gay lives, now there is this avoidance of talking about any sort of flamboyancy or femininity as though that is a step back. But what we need to do is just accept that there are more feminine men around there, more flamboyant men, and this does not mean that they are being too outwardly gay, that they are being too queer. Indeed, they could be seen as the most courageous because they are not trying to hide anything. And I think that Paul Baker explored that almost tragedy within here. He explored the lives of the people who use this language. He explored where the language came from, and he explored why it came to be. And I loved learning more about language and the way that language operates, but I also really appreciated the conversations this book led to, and also very much appreciated the things that I learned from this book, learning more about a history that I did not know about, and it made me feel this sort of connection almost, and this near sense of sorrow for what these people had to go through, but also this mix of joy that they were able to find a way to live their lives even through such troubling, difficult times. And I think that Paul Baker examined that history and told that history incredibly well. And then we have Fairyland by Alysia Abbott, another book that I've only just read, and this was a recommendation by Sarah over at Hardcover Hearts. As I mentioned in my wrap-up, and as I will continue to say, this is memoir as memoir ought to be written, using fiction writing techniques to propel a narrative onwards, strawberry picking certain aspects of your life and certain stories and vignettes from your life in order to craft the story of yourself and the father Alysia Abbott wants to talk about. Steve Abbott was a writer and a gay rights advocate living in 1970s San Francisco. And Alysia Abbott was his daughter from a marriage in which his wife died in a car crash. And the author of this book explores her relationship with her father, the difficulty sometimes they had connecting with one another. And as with good memoir, doesn't have this rose-tinted view of her life back then. She presents the world as she saw it at the time without slipping into any sort of reverie. And she does it with a great sense of storytelling. And she knows the pieces to pull together to tell this story to its fullest impact. And as with all good books, led me to want to go and read other pieces of non-fiction about the time she is discussing with reference to the writers and creators of the time that her father used to communicate with, and the losses that the gay community faced during the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, and the lack of funding and care from the American government at the time, and the ways in which gay people were viewed by the population, and the ways in which the AIDS epidemic was used to fuel certain fires within America. And I think that the author of this memoir definitely knew what she was doing when she set out to write this book, and it is just a genius piece of memoir, really. And them's the books. If you have read any of these and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.